December 29th, 1940, Washington, D.C. The President of the United States sat behind the resolute desk. His voice carried over radio waves into millions of American homes. Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke not to a nation at war, but to a nation standing on the edge of it. His words would define an age. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. The phrase was not a call to arms, but a call to industry. The United States would not yet send its sons to die in foreign fields. It would send ships, tanks, planes, and bullets. And the heart of that arsenal, the factory floor, the assembly line, the rhythmic pulse of mechanical America, would beat in Detroit, Michigan. At the dawn of 1941, Detroit was the undisputed capital of the automobile world. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had turned mass production into an art form. In the previous decade, they had manufactured millions of cars that rolled across America's highways, shining symbols of freedom, prosperity, and modernity. Now, those same companies were being asked to build something entirely different. Machines not of comfort and leisure, but of destruction and survival. At the center of this transformation stood William S. Knudsen, president of General Motors, a Danish immigrant who had risen from a toolmaker's bench to one of the highest industrial positions in America. Knudsen understood production like few men alive. When Roosevelt summoned him to Washington in 1940, Knudsen left behind a $300,000 a year salary to work for $1 a year as the Director of Industrial Mobilization. Knudsen's job was monumental: to turn an economy built for consumer goods into one capable of arming democracy itself. His first act, to convince Detroit that America's destiny would now be written not in dealerships, but in foundries. Yet Detroit's conversion would not come easily. Automobile factories were optimized for speed and repetition, but war demanded complexity and precision. A car's engine block and a tank's armor plate were not the same species of steel. A bomber's fuselage required tolerances unheard of on a 1930s assembly line. But Knudsen, joined by industrial titans like Henry Ford, Charles Sorensen, K.T. Keller, and Chrysler's engineering genius Carl Breer, saw the challenge not as a burden, but as a proving ground. At the Ford Motor Company's Rouge River plant, America's largest industrial facility, the shift began in early 1941. Car frames gave way to tank treads. Tooling stations, once stamping automobile panels, were reconfigured to shape armor for the M4 Sherman tank. Henry Ford himself was skeptical. A pacifist by instinct and a man distrustful of government control. But his son, Edsel Ford, saw the necessity of action. Under Edsel's leadership, Ford engineers devised plans for a new facility, a factory the likes of which the world had never seen. That plant would rise from a flat expanse of Michigan farmland near Ypsilanti. It would be called Willow Run. Designed by the legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn, Willow Run stretched nearly a mile long, its roof covering more than 3.5 million square feet of production space. Its purpose? To mass-produce one of the most complex machines ever built, the B-24 Liberator bomber. A plane that, in traditional aircraft factories, took over 2 months to build by hand. When construction began in April 1941, skeptics called the idea madness. No one had ever built heavy bombers on an assembly line. Aircraft, by their nature, required craftsmanship, not conveyor belts. But Detroit did not believe in impossibility. As the last steel beams of Willow Run were riveted in place in late 1941, Another industrial revolution unfolded across the city. Chrysler converted its sprawling Dodge main plant in Hamtramck into the Detroit tank arsenal. There, engineers developed the M3 Lee, and later the iconic M4 Sherman, the tank that would liberate Europe. General Motors, through its subsidiaries Buick, Cadillac and Fisher Body, turned out engines for aircraft, transmissions for tanks, and 75mm cannons by the tens of thousands. Packard Motor Car Company, once known for luxury automobiles, began building Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license, the same engines that powered Britain's Spitfires and America's P-51 Mustangs. By December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, the transformation was complete. Detroit, once the city of chrome and gasoline, had become the city of steel and fire. The war had begun.
Within weeks, Roosevelt created the War Production Board, centralizing control over materials, resources, and manufacturing priorities. Knudsen was joined by Donald Nelson of Sears Roebuck, and together they choreographed the most ambitious industrial mobilization in human history. Automobile production for civilians ceased entirely in February 1942. From that moment, Detroit belonged to the war. The statistics would defy comprehension. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Much of that came from the factories of Detroit and its surrounding industrial ring. At Willow Run, Ford's production line for the B-24 reached an almost unbelievable pace. By mid-1943, one completed bomber rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. Each plane contained 1.2 million parts, 550,000 rivets, and 5,000 feet of wiring. And yet, thanks to Detroit's techniques, they came together with the precision of a Model T. Reporters called Willow Run the Grand Canyon of industry. To stand on its floor was to witness modernity in motion, cranes lifting fuselages, sparks from 1,000 welders reflecting off polished aluminium, the air filled with the roar of assembly line engines being tested before installation. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant achieved similar feats. In 1943 alone, it produced 22,000 Sherman tanks, more than the combined output of all Axis nations. Engine blocks the size of bathtubs rolled down conveyors, while overhead gantries lowered 30-ton turrets into position. What had once been a car town was now an armory. But perhaps the most remarkable story of Detroit's wartime miracle lay not in machines, but in people. By 1944, more than 700,000 Detroiters worked directly in war production. They came from every corner of America, from the cotton fields of the South, from the mining towns of Pennsylvania, from farms in Iowa and Arkansas. And for the first time in history, tens of thousands of women and African Americans took their places on the factory floor. Rosie the Riveter was not a myth in Detroit, she was real. Women like Rose Will Monroe, a riveter at Willow Run, became the face of the movement, their hands guiding the very rivets that held bombers together. Black workers, long excluded from industrial unions, filled vital roles in welding, machining, and inspection. In 1942, under pressure from labor organizers and civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, prohibiting discrimination in defense industries. The result was an unprecedented integration of America's industrial workforce. a quiet social revolution beneath the roar of machinery. By 1944, Detroit had earned its wartime title, the Arsenal of Democracy. The numbers tell the story better than any speech. Ford built over 8,600 B-24 bombers. General Motors produced 119,000 aircraft engines. Chrysler built 25,000 tanks. Packard delivered 55,000 Merlin engines. Combined, Detroit's output accounted for nearly 1/3 of all American war material. And yet, the story did not end with victory. When peace returned in 1945, Detroit's factories began the slow reconversion to civilian production. Willow Run switched from bombers to automobiles. The tank lines at Chrysler returned to cars. The skills learned, the tools invented, and the methods refined during the war would define American manufacturing for a generation. Automation, just-in-time production, and large-scale logistics, all concepts born in wartime Detroit, would power the economic boom of the 1950s. But the deeper legacy of the Arsenal of Democracy was philosophical. It proved that in the moment of greatest peril, ordinary citizens could become extraordinary producers. That the hands which once built engines for pleasure could build engines for freedom. When Roosevelt first spoke the phrase Arsenal of Democracy, he could not have known the full scope of what it would mean. But by war's end, the meaning was written across the skies of Europe, across the beaches of Normandy, across the islands of the Pacific, in the hum of engines and the thunder of liberation. It was written in steel and sweat, in oil and courage, and at its heart it was written by Detroit.
February 1941. An empty stretch of farmland 30 miles west of Detroit lay silent beneath the winter wind. A scattering of barns, a handful of houses, and a winding dirt road were all that marked the landscape. But within months, this quiet patch of Michigan soil would become the largest industrial plant on Earth, a place where airplanes would roll off assembly lines as quickly as cars once did. Its name would echo through history. Willow Run. The idea had begun not in the halls of government, but in the restless mind of Edsel Ford. The son of America's most famous industrialist, Edsel had inherited not just the Ford Motor Company, but also his father's ambition, tempered by vision and empathy. While Henry Ford remained a reluctant participant in war preparations, still hoping to avoid entanglement in European conflicts, Edsel recognized what was coming. He saw that America's security would soon depend on production, and that Detroit's factories could become the weapons of democracy. In late 1940, Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. Night after night, German bombers rained fire on London. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered and exhausted, desperately needed reinforcements. One aircraft stood at the center of hope: the consolidated B-24 Liberator. It was fast, long-ranged, and capable of carrying more bombs than any plane before it. But it was also complex. 1.2 million parts, nearly 50,000 different components, and each one traditionally built by hand. No one believed mass production of a heavy bomber was possible. Aircraft were still the domain of craftsmen, not assembly lines. But when the government approached the Ford Motor Company, asking if it could manufacture B-24s in volume, Edsel Ford did not hesitate. "Yes," he said, "we can build them, if you'll let us build them our way." That promise would give birth to an industrial miracle. Construction began in the spring of 1941, Edsel Ford called upon Albert Kahn, the legendary industrial architect who had already reshaped Detroit's skyline with the Rouge River plant. Kahn's design for the new factory at Willow Run defied all convention. It would stretch nearly a mile long, with over 3.5 million square feet of floor space. The building was so vast that its far end curved simply to follow the curvature of the earth. It was said that rain clouds could form beneath its roof. As thousands of workers poured in, many of them farmers, housewives, and young men too old or too young for the draft, the once quiet farmland transformed into a city of steel and sparks. Over 40,000 workers would eventually call Willow Run home. Entire neighborhoods, schools, and stores sprang up overnight to serve them. The population exploded so rapidly that the government built an entire town called Willow Run Village just to house the workers. Inside the factory, a new kind of industrial warfare was taking shape. Charles Sorensen, Ford's master of production, known as Cast Iron Charlie, oversaw the design of the assembly line. He envisioned a process where aircraft would move nose to tail down a continuous line, each station performing one part of the build, just as Ford had done with the Model T 3 decades earlier. The skeptics were many. Aircraft engineers scoffed at the idea. "You can't build airplanes the way you build automobiles," they said. "Each bomber must be hand-fitted, tested, and adjusted. It's too complex for conveyor belts." But Sorensen ignored them. On Christmas Eve 1940, he cleared a long wooden table at the Ford Engineering Laboratory in Dearborn and began sketching. By dawn, he had drawn the world's first blueprint for an aircraft assembly line. When the first B-24 parts began arriving from Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, the learning curve was brutal. Early production faltered. Components didn't fit. Rivets missed their marks. The first bombers took months to complete. Critics whispered that the experiment had failed, that Ford had overpromised and underdelivered. But Detroit did not quit. Every failure was logged, analysed, and corrected. Jigs and fixtures were redesigned to eliminate hand fitting. Tolerances were tightened. Subassemblies, wings, fuselages, tail sections, were built in parallel in separate bays, then brought together on massive transporters that rolled between assembly lines. Ford applied everything it had learned from 3 decades of automobile manufacturing: standardization, division of labor, precision tooling, and merged it with aviation craftsmanship. By the summer of 1942, the line was humming. Each day brought improvement. Each bomber took less time than the one before. And by early 1943, the impossible had become routine. A complete B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The world had never seen anything like it. Newsreel cameras captured the sight of bombers emerging from the massive hangar doors, their olive-drab wings gleaming in the Michigan sunlight, engines roaring as test pilots taxied them down the runway. Reporters called Willow Run the Grand Canyon of industry. The New York Times wrote, "Here, the sky itself seems to take shape on the floor." Each B-24 that left Willow Run represented the work of thousands. Men and women working around the clock, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. In one corner of the factory, you could see women in overalls operating pneumatic rivet guns, the rhythmic tat-tat-tat echoing through the hangar. In another, African-American welders guided molten seams along aluminium frames. Inspectors moved along catwalks, clipboard in hand, checking every inch of skin for cracks or warping. At its peak, more than 40% of Willow Run's workforce were women, a symbol of the nation's total mobilization. One of them was Rose Will Monroe, a riveter from Kentucky who became the face of the movement, immortalized as Rosie the Riveter. Her image appeared on posters, her story in newspapers, and her voice in the anthem that swept across the country. We can do it. By 1944, Ford's Willow Run had built over 8,600 B-24 bombers, nearly half of all ever produced. Each aircraft cost roughly $38,369,430 Kenyan shillings, weighed 18 tons, and could fly 2,100 miles carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs. The B-24s from Willow Run flew over Ploiesti, over Berlin, over the jungles of Burma and the beaches of Normandy. They became the workhorses of the Allied air campaign, built not in secret laboratories or military arsenals, but by the ordinary citizens of Michigan. Yet the miracle came at a cost. Working conditions were grueling. The factory never slept. Winter air cut through the vast hangar doors. Summer heat turned the floor into an oven. Turnover was high, morale fragile. But despite exhaustion and hardship, the workers pressed on, driven by the belief that every rivet, every bolt, every panel mattered. Some had lost sons overseas, some were too old to fight, but all shared one mission: to help win the war from home. In 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, the lines at Willow Run came to a halt. The last bomber rolled out under a banner that read, "The job is done." Within weeks, the plant that had once shaken with machinery fell quiet. Its workers returned to their homes, its runways empty except for a few test flights. But the legacy of Willow Run was just beginning. The techniques pioneered there, large-scale prefabrication, precision assembly, industrial automation, became the blueprint for post-war manufacturing. Every modern production facility, from automotive plants to aerospace factories, carries the DNA of Willow Run. It proved that complexity could be conquered by process, that craftsmanship could be multiplied by machinery, and that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when united by purpose. When President Roosevelt first called for an arsenal of democracy, he imagined a nation arming itself for survival. But what emerged was something greater. A revolution in how humanity built, created, and imagined. And nowhere did that revolution burn brighter than beneath the vast roof of Willow Run, the factory that built the sky. When the first B-24 parts began arriving from Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, the learning curve was brutal. Early production faltered, components didn't fit, rivets missed their marks. The first bombers took months to complete. Critics whispered that the experiment had failed, that Ford had overpromised and underdelivered. But Detroit did not quit. Every failure was logged, analysed, and corrected. Jigs and fixtures were redesigned to eliminate hand fitting. Tolerances were tightened. Subassemblies,
Wings, fuselages, tail sections were built in parallel in separate bays, then brought together on massive transporters that rolled between assembly lines. Ford applied everything it had learned from 3 decades of automobile manufacturing: standardization, division of labor, precision tooling, and merged it with aviation craftsmanship. By the summer of 1942, the line was humming. Each day brought improvement. Each bomber took less time than the one before. And by early 1943, the impossible had become routine. A complete B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The world had never seen anything like it. Newsreel cameras captured the sight of bombers emerging from the massive hangar doors, their olive-drab wings gleaming in the Michigan sunlight, engines roaring as test pilots taxied them down the runway. Reporters called Willow Run the Grand Canyon of industry. The New York Times wrote, "Here, the sky itself seems to take shape on the floor." Each B-24 that left Willow Run represented the work of thousands. Men and women working around the clock, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. In one corner of the factory, you could see women in overalls operating pneumatic rivet guns, the rhythmic tat-tat-tat echoing through the hangar. In another, African-American welders guided molten seams along aluminium frames. Inspectors moved along catwalks, clipboard in hand, checking every inch of skin for cracks or warping. At its peak, more than 40% of Willow Run's workforce were women, a symbol of the nation's total mobilization. One of them was Rose Will Monroe, a riveter from Kentucky who became the face of the movement, immortalized as Rosie the Riveter. Her image appeared on posters, her story in newspapers, and her voice in the anthem that swept across the country. We can do it. By 1944, Ford's Willow Run had built over 8,600 B-24 bombers, nearly half of all ever produced. Each aircraft cost roughly $38,369,430 Kenyan shillings, weighed 18 tons, and could fly 2,100 miles carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs. The B-24s from Willow Run flew over Ploiesti, over Berlin, over the jungles of Burma and the beaches of Normandy. They became the workhorses of the Allied air campaign, built not in secret laboratories or military arsenals, but by the ordinary citizens of Michigan. Yet the miracle came at a cost. Working conditions were grueling. The factory never slept. Winter air cut through the vast hangar doors. Summer heat turned the floor into an oven. Turnover was high, morale fragile. But despite exhaustion and hardship, the workers pressed on, driven by the belief that every rivet, every bolt, every panel mattered. Some had lost sons overseas, some were too old to fight, but all shared one mission: to help win the war from home. In 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, the lines at Willow Run came to a halt. The last bomber rolled out under a banner that read, "The job is done." Within weeks, the plant that had once shaken with machinery fell quiet. Its workers returned to their homes, its runways empty except for a few test flights. But the legacy of Willow Run was just beginning. The techniques pioneered there, large-scale prefabrication, precision assembly, industrial automation, became the blueprint for post-war manufacturing. Every modern production facility, from automotive plants to aerospace factories, carries the DNA of Willow Run. It proved that complexity could be conquered by process, that craftsmanship could be multiplied by machinery, and that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when united by purpose. When President Roosevelt first called for an arsenal of democracy, he imagined a nation arming itself for survival. But what emerged was something greater. A revolution in how humanity built, created, and imagined. And nowhere did that revolution burn brighter than beneath the vast roof of Willow Run, the factory that built the sky.
Keller and his engineers at Chrysler broke down the tank into over 10,000 separate components. Each part was standardized so that factories across the country, from Fisher Body to American Locomotive, could build them interchangeably. Tolerances were set to thousandths of an inch. Every gear, every bolt, every tread had a part number and a purpose. Detroit's car-building genius had been weaponized. By 1942, the arsenal of democracy was in full roar. Shift whistles blew at dawn and midnight alike. The plant never slept. Tens of thousands of workers, men and women, flooded its gates every day. Some came straight from Ford's Willow Run plant after night shifts. Others took streetcars from Detroit, their lunch pails rattling with the rhythm of war. Inside, you could hear the steady thunder of progress, the hammering of rivets, the grind of steel tracks, the hiss of welders sealing hulls in showers of light. Engines were lowered into frames, turrets mounted on hulls, and finally, the tanks rolled toward the testing grounds outside the factory walls. There, beneath the grey Michigan sky, each Sherman came alive, engines roaring, treads churning through snow and mud. The ground trembled as one after another the machines of war came to life. Reporters called it the Tank City. The army called it the Arsenal. And for the soldiers waiting overseas, it was salvation made of steel. Each Sherman that rolled out of Detroit was not just a tank. It was a lifeline. They crossed the deserts of El Alamein, crushed through the hedgerows of France, and rolled into Berlin. They weren't perfect. German Tigers and Panthers could outgun them. But the Sherman's strength was not in superiority. It was in numbers, reliability, and spirit. Where the Germans built 1,500 tanks a year, Detroit built 1,500 a month. By the end of the war, Chrysler's Detroit arsenal had produced over 22,000 tanks, more than any single plant in history. Its workers had forged not just machines, but momentum, the relentless output that allowed Allied forces to overwhelm the Axis through sheer industrial might. It was said that Detroit outbuilt Hitler. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. When the war ended in 1945, the arsenal's mission shifted. The clatter of tank treads gave way to peacetime silence. But the legacy of the plant endured. It had proven that America's strength was not only on the battlefield, it was on the factory floor. Men and women who had never seen combat had nonetheless fought the war in their own way, with lathes and welders, with grease and grit, with heart. In the decades that followed, the Detroit arsenal continued to build tanks, Pattons, Abrams, and beyond, evolving with each generation. But its foundation remained the same, the belief that freedom could be forged in steel,
that democracy could be built by hand, and that the ordinary worker could help shape the destiny of nations. Today, the old arsenal stands as both a museum and a monument to the engineers, welders, riveters, and dreamers who once filled its halls. Its echoes still carry the rhythm of Detroit's heartbeat, a reminder that in the darkest days of war, it was not only soldiers who fought for victory. It was a city, a people, an idea. Detroit, the arsenal of democracy, the city that built the tanks that helped save the world.
The year was 1935. The Great Depression still clung to America like a long grey shadow. Factories stood half silent, and the future of flight was uncertain. But in a quiet corner of Boeing Field in Seattle, a small team of engineers gathered around a silver prototype, a machine that looked unlike anything the world had ever seen. They called it the Model 299. It would soon earn another name, the Flying Fortress. As the sun rose over Puget Sound that July morning, test pilot Leslie Tower climbed into the cockpit. 4 engines gleamed beneath the wings, 4, at a time when most bombers had 2. This was aviation on a new scale. All metal, monoplane, retractable landing gear. A range twice that of any US bomber. It was sleek, fast, and bristling with machine guns. A fortress, indeed. The prototype lifted gracefully from the runway and soared into the sky, a vision of America's future. But only weeks later, tragedy struck. During a demonstration flight for the US Army, a simple oversight, the control locks left engaged, sent the Model 299 crashing on takeoff. 2 men died. The dream could have died with them. Most companies would have folded, but Boeing refused. Engineers analyzed the wreckage, redesigned systems, and documented every lesson. They introduced the first ever pre-flight checklist, a procedure that would save countless lives for generations to come. When the Army held new trials, they allowed Boeing to keep producing a limited batch. The designation was changed, B-17, and thus began the legend. By 1940, the clouds of war had darkened the world once more. Europe was burning. Britain was bleeding. The Luftwaffe owned the skies. And across the Atlantic, the United States prepared to arm itself, not for defense, but for endurance. At the center of that effort stood the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the most advanced heavy bomber America had ever built. Boeing's factories in Seattle roared to life, soon joined by Douglas in California and Lockheed Vega in Burbank. The triangle of production stretched across the West Coast, each plant feeding parts and planes into the great aerial armada. Aluminium sheets rolled in by the trainload. Riveters worked shoulder to shoulder, sparks dancing in the air as the skeletons of giants took form. Each B-17 was a masterpiece of engineering. Over 350,000 individual parts, 9,600 rivets, 13 guns, and 4 Wright Cyclone engines, producing 1,200 horsepower each. It could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs and fly more than 2,000 miles. And it could take punishment like nothing before it. Stories began to circulate, of B-17s returning home with half their tails missing,
engines shot out, fuselages torn open, yet still somehow flying. They were more than aircraft. They were symbols of resilience. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the B-17 became the spearhead of a new kind of strategy. Daylight precision bombing. The mission was simple in words, but brutal in execution. Fly deep into Nazi-occupied Europe in broad daylight. Find a target and destroy it with accuracy. Without fighter escort at first. It was courage against calculation, steel against flak, man against machine. In August 1942, the first B-17s of the 8th Air Force took off from England for their baptism of fire over Rouen, France. From that day forward, the skies over Europe would never be quiet again. Each mission meant hours of cold, fear, and deafening noise. Inside the tight aluminium fuselage, 10 young men lived and fought together. Pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, gunners. The air at altitude was thin and freezing. Frost gathered on their masks. Oxygen hissed through lines. Tracer rounds streaked by the windows. Flak bursts painted black flowers in the sky. The losses were staggering. Early missions saw crews vanish by the dozens. Some squadrons lost half their planes in a single raid. But still, they kept flying. Through Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, and Berlin. Names that became etched into memory. They flew because they believed that every bomb dropped would shorten the war, that every mission mattered. The B-17 was not the fastest bomber, nor the largest, but it was forgiving. It brought its men home, and for those who fought inside it, it became something almost alive, a trusted companion, forged in aluminum and courage. As the war dragged on, the B-17 evolved from the early C models to the definitive B-17G, equipped with a chin turret to counter head-on attacks. Production soared. By 1944, a new Flying Fortress rolled off an American assembly line every 90 minutes. Women made up nearly a third of the workforce. Riveters, inspectors, assemblers. The hands that built the wings of freedom. Factories ran night and day. The sound of hammers and drills mixing with the hum of patriotism. And the results were undeniable. B-17 formations blackened the skies over Germany, striking at factories, rail yards and oil fields, cutting off the lifeblood of the Reich. Each mission brought losses, but each success brought victory closer. By the time the war ended, over 12,700 B-17s had been built. Of those, nearly 5,000 were lost in combat. But the skies they conquered helped break the Nazi war machine. In the spring of 1945, when the final bombing missions ended, the Flying Fortress had earned its name 1,000 times over. It had carried 10 men and their courage across continents and back. It had endured storms of steel, yet always seemed to find its way home. After the war, thousands of B-17s were scrapped, melted down, or sold for pennies. The great aluminum fleet that once filled the sky was reduced to silence. But those who had flown them never forgot. They spoke of the smell of oil and cordite, the rattle of gunfire, the steady heartbeat of 4 engines, holding them above a hostile world. To them, the B-17 wasn't just a plane. It was a brother, a guardian, a memory. Today, only a handful remain in the air. Their engines still roar over air shows and museums, echoes of a time when the world's fate hung on the strength of their wings, when the arsenal of democracy took flight. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, forged in aluminum and courage, a machine that helped save civilization and the men who made it immortal.